Okay, let's finish this off. History, a timeline. Migration. The nearly 400 years between 300 and 695 is known as the Migration Period. During this period, the Mark, Sword, Volg, and Agno tribes moved from the Great North to the southern part of the Merkopa continent. Historians claim the primary reason for this migration was extreme weather conditions which led to the Great Famine in the north. As the northern tribes migrated towards the south, they encountered and passed by many lands until they reached the lands of Rum. The leaders of the tribes requested a hefty payment of gold in exchange of a peace agreement. The Rums, who thought that the primitive soldiers and horsemen could be no match to their organized forces, rejected to pay money. Consequently, thousands of villages and towns were raided, and the hordes of the tribes kept avoiding the main forces of the Rums while creating havoc in their lands. This prompted the king of the Rums to sign a peace agreement, which allowed the tribes to settle in their lands. Resources gained from the subsequent raids helped the migrators immensely and doomed the Rums for the next 100 years. Despite being allied during the migration, the tribes increasingly grew apart over the next decade. The land disputes became commonplace, and conflicts between the tribes pushed them in different directions. That puts a whole new perspective on the current Rumburgian aggression. No doubt feeling that they are taking back their lands. Tribal Wars. The period between 695 and 1113 is known as the Tribal Wars period. In the 700s, as the tribes settled and borders started to get drawn, the initial resentment between the tribes started to develop towards large-scale raids and border conflicts. After several centuries of constant conflict, the Mark tribe, led by a Khan named Ungar, managed to unite the tribes under his leadership. Historians claim that by the year 1000, Khan Ungar had already dominated all nearby tribes and fledgling nations under the tribe of the Marks. Following the rise of the Marks, the Volgs fled across the Grey Strait for refuge and settled on the island which they called Volgos. Threatened by the expansion of the Marks, the Lesbians in the south built many castles and walls to protect themselves against the wrath of the Khan. When the Mark tribes settled in the cities of the Rums and Lesbians, feudal lines were drawn. They united the lands from central Merkopa to eastern Merkopa, becoming the largest country on Earth. Interesting. These lands became known as Markia. In the year 1113, Khan Ungar declared the Markian Empire and announced his aims to dominate the entire Merkopan continent and be crowned as conqueror of the world. Markian Empire. In 1113, the Markian Empire was the largest country in the world. It was also considered to be the most advanced civilization. Its capital was where Urthari is located today and was named Karakumun. With a population of almost 10 million people, the empire was sprawling with trade, culture, and arts. The golden age of the empire started with the death of Ungar in 1125 and lasted more than 3 centuries. The height of the empire was reached in 1440, when it stretched so far and wide that messages being carried by horse would take several months to reach their destination. The empire was a massive multicultural melting pot which gave no privileges for any specific culture. This started to change in the mid-16th century when the identity of Markian became far more dominant, with Emperor Turuk coming to power. He married into the second strongest family of the Markian Empire, the Rezhnik, and who had their support base from the Wezek people in the west. In the late 16th century, the Markian Empire stagnated, and its massive size was taking a toll on its economy, with its newly built advanced imperial highways being too expensive for the state to maintain. When Emperor Turuk died in 1599, his wife, along with the entire Rezhnik family, overthrew the Marks and seized control of the empire. Following this, many major regions of the empire took the moment to break away. First, Rumburg stopped paying its tribute, and a year later Agnolia broke away and declared its own kingdom. As the Wezek people were unifying their internal strength, the kingdom of Valgos took the opportunity to invade several islands off the coast of the Markian Empire and expand its already threatening sea power over the eastern and southern sides of the Merkopan continent. When the Markian imperial army had gathered to march to war against the breakaway states, most parts of the empire were already in complete disarray, and more countries broke away. They finally did strike the biggest target they could, Rumburg. The bloody conflict raged for 20 years. It became known as the War of the Dying Roses. In the early 17th century, the Sordish people unified under the increasingly influential trade family Rayne, who formed their own autonomous governance system in the core territories of the empire. Following this, the Reznik family decided it was too late to salvage the situation and retreated from the mainland of the empire to their own land in the west, where the majority of Wessex lived. In 1630, Baron Warrengrad declared Wayland as an independent kingdom in the lands of the Wessex. He was followed by Albrecht Rayne, who seized the capital of the empire and declared the Rayne within the same year, effectively ending the Markian Empire. It's almost like they tried to mash every history of Eurasia into one for our history. The Rayne aristocracy. The time between 1630 and 1866 is known as the Rayne aristocracy period. Albrecht Rayne, unlike the other members in the rich family of Rayne, was more of a people's man than an aristocrat. His father had owned most of the Markian South Mercopa Trade Company, therefore most of those assets were in his hands when he formed the Rayne aristocracy in Korakumun, which at the time would account for an entire nation's GDP. In a time where welfare did not exist, the Rayne aristocracy gave the poorest farmers basic clinical treatment in the capital Korakumun, which by 1649 had been renamed Erlery. Although a shadow of its former past, it still was a huge population center filled with many people who still remained from the Markian Empire. Most of the population was made up by swords who had become quite dominant in the day-to-day running of the government. The nation was informally called Sordland, despite officially being Rayne. The country advanced and improved well into Albrecht's 60s. Rumburgian King Edward saw an opportunity to claim the riches of Rayne when his country was still suffering under economic problems due to the War of Dying Roses. He seized the moment and attacked the northern borders of Rayne, raising many settlements. As the battles went on, the war slowly started to look worse for Rayne when Rumburg inched closer to the heartland of swords. At this time, Albrecht was growing too old to lead the nation, already in his late 70s. Eric, the son of Albrecht, was groomed to take over the rulership and the war effort. He was 24 years old when he became the head of Rayne, and with the advice of his Agnolian mistress, he pursued an alliance with Agnolia, which was at the time ailing from Volgos raids and were equally threatened by Rumburg. Agnolian Queen Lena was keen on an alliance as she saw mutual benefit, but also fell in love with Eric. Despite protests from Eric's mistress, who gave him the idea in the first place, Eric married Queen Lena. To nobody's expectation, a united front against Rumburg was formed with the marriage of the two sovereign rulers. During this period, Eric and Lena co-ruled both nations, which technically turned Sordland and Agnolia into a single state. Together, they also stopped the invading armies and regained some of the lost territories. Meanwhile, Volgos stopped their raids into Agnolia, but the Rumburg war exhaustion was proving too damaging for the little gains made. In 1710, a peace treaty was signed between the three nations. When Lena passed away in 1740, the two unified countries split again, and Agnolia fell into a civil war between three families claiming the kingdom. The Duke of West Agnolia decided to remain in Rayne and did not join the conflict. The territory was later renamed Agenland. After the Civil War, Agnolia was re-established as a merchant republic with a rector at its head. In the early 19th century, the world witnessed the beginning of the century of revolutions. In Rayne, however, the winds of change would not blow until 1833, when the people, inspired by ideas of nationalism from the nearby kingdoms, started a revolution against the Rayne family. Nationalist revolutionaries proclaimed that the aristocracy was preventing the swords from reaching their full potential as a nation. Less fortunate parts of the country began to incite violence against privileged Blutish and Wessex traders. The nationalist revolution began in 1859 and resulted in the destruction of the Rayne aristocracy, along with the massacre of the entire Rayne lineage. Sordland was surrounded by wars for a period of 7 years and was broken into smaller regional and city-states. The chaos of the revolution lasted until 1866, when a nationalist leader called Egmund, who claimed to be the descendant of the Markian emperors as well as a purple blood, managed to unite the nation under the kingdom of Sordland. Just want to see here. Okay, so it looks like we do come upon that stuff. The Kingdom of Sordland. The Kingdom of Sordland period began in 1866 with the fall of the Rhenan aristocracy and lasted until 1923. It was primarily ruled by King Egmund, who claimed to be purple blood, a 19th century ethnic concept that established Sordish nationalism and pride. The king changed the identity of the country and distanced himself from the old aristocratic systems. One of his first changes was relocating the capital from Ullery to Hull. The city was also renamed from Hull to Holsword, meaning both High Sword and High City. After securing the throne, Egmund attacked the weakest neighboring country, Wayland, in a show of strength. The successive battles increased the fame of the Sordish army in the Merkopa continent. This was King Egmund's first successful conquest, which expanded the realm westward by capturing the West Bludia, or Bergia region of Wayland. Here the Bludish people resided for thousands of years. At first they welcomed the Sordish soldiers as saviors, as they had suffered under the iron fist of their previous ruler. Soon after the annexation, the Bludish people were treated with similar respect by the Sordish to what they had previously endured. In comparison, the Agnolians, living under Sordish rule, were treated far better by King Egmund. He gave them as much freedom as possible, and Agnolians slowly assimilated into Sordish culture. The designation Agno-Sordish was established for those who accepted Sordish citizenship. In 1870, Alfred II of Rumburg launched an invasion into Sordland after King Egmund's cancellation of the friendship deal between the two countries. The war was short-lived and did not result in a victory for either side. It came to be known as the 15-Day War. After the war, King Egmund seized all Rhenan assets into his personal treasury and ended expensive welfare programs that were established before his reign. This backfired, resulting in the largest protest in Sordish history to that day. The people rallied behind Artur S. Vichy, the leader of the Republican faction in the King's Parliament, who was inspired by the parliamentary republics of Western Merkopa and the socialist revolutions in Contana. The pressure caused the king to revert some of the programs to avoid a full-blown rebellion. In 1891, a powerful figure named Heron Walt rose to power in the Royalist faction and was appointed as the primary advisor of the king. Heron was a skilled architect and manager who had traveled the world to examine successful projects and advancements in order to apply them to the Kingdom of Sordland. His most successful works were the agro-city of Dare, Volgan Dam, and the free trade zone of Sarna. These massive projects elevated the cities from poverty and revitalized the economy, which also boosted the popularity of King Egmund in a critical time. He was later awarded the highest honor by Egmund, Hero of the King. In 1915, territorial sea disputes arose between the Kingdom of Sordland and the Empire of Volgos, who was a large colonial power at the time. The latter retaliated by embargoing Sordland ships. At this time, the Volgos fleet was the largest in the world. The embargo damaged the Kingdom of Sordland extensively, causing isolation and posing a massive threat to sea trade in an already precarious time. There were other internal issues in Sordland, including Egmund's failure to give birth to male heirs. His only child was a daughter named Jule. Jule? I never know. This is a fake words and language, and I don't know the vowel sounds. We'll say Jula because it sounds better than just Jule, who was too young to rule and deemed unfit by Egmund's royalist advisors. Meanwhile, King Egmund's grip on Sordland was slipping as his old age was showing. The century of revolutions kept sweeping through neighboring countries, when in a shocking turn, the king's advisor Heron Walt also radicalized by the revolutionary Artur S. Vichy. He then abandoned the king and followed Vichy to revolution. This started a chain of events that led Vichy to energize the public with democratic ideas. Thousands gathered in a march, which was also joined by the First Army that abandoned the king to support the revolutionaries. Together, the movement overthrew the king of the Republic of Sordland, and the Republic of Sordland was proclaimed. Artur S. Vichy was declared. See, there we go again, changing the spelling of was declared the first president of Sordland by the provisional government. The royal family was exiled from Sordland to avoid further bloodshed and suffering. Changing the Kingdom of Sordland. Wow, that word's not even there. Despite the Kingdom of Sordland lasting half a century, this period is regarded as a turning point for Sordland because of the establishment of the national identity and foundation of a democracy. The Republic of Sordland. Sordland, officially the Republic of Sordland, is a country located in East Merkopa, lying between the Sorn Mountains to the northwest, the Markian Sea to the northeast, the Cavendier and Gumran Mountains to the west, the Unger River to the south, and the Antisaean Sea to the east. Sordland is bordered on its north by Rumburg and Agnolia, and its south by Wayland and Lesbia. Sordland is a unitary presidential republic with its capital in Holsord, which is the country's largest city. Its second most populous city is Dare, and its financial center is Lockhaven. Other major urban areas include Volgan, Anrika, Gelsord, Benfi, Arvuri, and Conriat. The official language is Sordish. The fall of Raynan aristocracy and the independence wars of many countries in western Merkopa in the 19th century prompted the establishment of the Sordish nationalist movement, which was strengthened further by King Egmund, who founded the Kingdom of Sordland on nationalistic ideas and claimed to be purple blood. The century of revolutions soon overtook the kingdom with a strong democratic revolutionary movement led by Artur Vichy. On the 9th of September 1923, the revolutionary movement abolished the monarchy and formed a new government in Holsord, declaring itself the legitimate government of the country. This formalized the legal transition of Sordland from a constitutional monarchy into a new republican system. This period is considered to be the start of the era of the First Republic of Sordland. Artur S. Vichy became the republic's first president, introduced many reforms, and ordered the exile of the royal family. The reforms aimed to transform the religion and nationality-based monarchy into a secular and democratic state that would be governed as a presidential republic. The government of Vichy was influenced by most parliamentary democracies in western Merkopa and the socialist states in Rakantana, which aimed to transition Sordland from its initial presidential system into a parliamentary system and to introduce socialist reforms in the following years. The government introduced a multi-party system and scheduled the first elections to be held in 1927. Following the multi-party reforms, many political parties were formed, some of which promoted monarchism, anti-secularism, and anti-communism. This prompted protests from the Republicans and Socialists, who claimed these parties should not be allowed to enter the elections. In 1927, ahead of the first elections, General Lutheran of the Sordish Armed Forces led a military coup against the government, abolished the constitution, and declared martial law, citing left-wing riots as the justification for the military junta he established. He ordered the arrest of President Vichy and the executions of hundreds of revolutionaries and communist politicians, effectively ending the era of the First Republic of Sordland. In 1928, following the mass executions of the martial law period, General Ricard attempted to seize power from Lutheran and led an attack against the new administration. This led to the start of the Sordish Civil War, which lasted until 1929. In 1929, the Sordish Civil War was brought to an end by Colonel Tarquin Sol and his 6th Army, which successfully destroyed both General Ricard and Lutheran's forces. He captured Holsord and became the de facto head of state. During his de facto rule, Sol wrote a new constitution and formed the United Sordland Party. He held elections in the same year with the participation of only one party and was subsequently elected the second president of Sordland. This is considered by many as the start of the era of the Second Republic of Sordland. Others claim that this date should be regarded as the true start of the modern Republic of Sordland due to the first period of the Republic being short-lived. Tarquin Sol served as president between 1929 and 1949, enacting many reforms which saw many developments in healthcare, military technology, and sciences. He pursued a planned economy, nationalized many key industries, brought an end to the decades-long energy crisis, and implemented free education and healthcare systems. In 1930, Sordland was invited and joined the OMEC. In 1933, he brought the multi-party system back and held the first elections ever of Sordland with more than one political party. The conflict between the BFF and Sordland also started in 1933 and has been active since, primarily in the Bergia region. The third president of Sordland was Ewald Alfonso, who was elected in 1949 following his victory against Tarquin Sol in the USP Congress of 1946. The presidency of Alfonso saw many economic reforms, privatized many key industries, and pursued greater political and cultural rights in Sordland. Since the liberalization of the Sordish economy in the early 50s, the country has suffered an economic crisis in 1951 and a subsequent recession in the following years. In the 1953 elections, Anton Rayne was elected the 4th president of Sordland. That's the end of that. So let's go into the actual events themselves. The Wayland Civil War. It has been 2 decades since the events that unfolded in the Wayland Civil War. Many remember the bitter tragedies of the war that resulted in starvation, disease, and genocide. Historians now evaluate the Wayland Civil War as a proxy war fought between Arcasia and United Kantana. Initially, internal instability was triggered by the rise of a left-wing militia in the mountainous regions close to Sordland. The Sordish couxist, General Ricard, is said to have allowed hundreds of operatives and arms to Wayland. At first, Wayland decided to ally with Arcasia for them to send security forces to deal with the seemingly weak insurgency, but as the years passed, their efforts were unsuccessful, and this led to the growth of Arcasian military and economic support. Internally, the country was heading to an economic collapse due to the instability preventing trade, which was crucial to the Wayland economy. Things got worse when Lesbia, Rumburg, and Arcasia shut down their borders after the threat of the conflict, jumping to their territories because of ethnic clashes. At that point, arms flowing into Wayland had reached a critical level, and the fighting began to reach the cities. Arcasian troops created security checkpoints at all major hubs, but were increasingly getting surrounded. The Wazek soldiers, not as well trained or equipped, couldn't beat back the Kantanen-supported left-wing militias. As Wayland destabilized, the horrors got worse. Millions of refugees tried to flee to neighboring countries like Sordland, Lesbia, and Rumburg. However, most of these countries turned their backs, so hundreds of thousands died in what was called the Death March. In the year 1931, the government of Wayland fell, and Arcasian troops evacuated out of the country in a hurry. Ever since then, Wayland is regarded as a failed state. There have been good strides at gaining back the stability the country had before the war. This one is worded a lot differently than the other entries. Makes me think it was either written as just footnotes or by someone else entirely. The Great Fire of Conriat. In the year 1789, the navy of the Empire of Volgos, encouraged by the Rhénan army fighting in Rumburg territory, sailed across the sea. During the first night of June, as many residents in Conriat were asleep, the fleet destroyed several patrol boats and got within a kilometer of the harbor. The Vogsland fleet, without any formal declaration of war, let loose a barrage at the Sordish main fleet anchored at port and sunk most of the navy, even before the sailors could get to their ships. Then the 80-ship-strong fleet loaded incendiary shots and fired barrage after barrage towards the city for 3 days. The fire spread so fast that many people couldn't even escape their own homes and burned alive. By the time the Raynon family had received the news, it was all too late. The strategically significant Sordish navy was destroyed, and the Raynon army couldn't do anything due to the ongoing conflict with Rumburg. Records indicate that 90% of the city was destroyed that day. More than 40,000 people lost their lives, including 8,000 soldiers who couldn't even retaliate. After this point, Volgos claimed sea dominance, and the Raynon navy never recovered fully. Many Sordish citizens today regard this incident as the Great Betrayal, but the current Vogsland government condemns the act and detaches itself from the acts of their previous governments of Volgos. The Century of Revolutions is a period from the early 19th to the early 20th centuries in which a number of significant revolutionary movements occurred in most of Mercopa and Cantana. The period is noted for the change from absolutist monarchies to representative governments with a written constitution and the creation of nation-states as well as socialist states. Influenced by the ideas of the 19th century, the Arcasian Revolution in the year 1823 is usually considered the starting point of the Century of Revolutions, when King Jonathan XII of the Kingdom of Arcasia was overthrown by the Arcasian people, establishing the world's first democratic republic. During the Century of Revolutions, the ideals of democracy, communism, and nationalism spread to almost all corners of the world from Mercopa to Cantana. In some places, it toppled brutal monarchies, and others it brought down enlightened meritocracies. The last remaining empires splintered into smaller nation-states. One of the fundamental shifts occurred in the splintered continent of Cantana, which suffered from dozens of regional wars before it transformed into an expansive collection of united socialist states. The revolutionary transformation was led by Leon Malenev, whose political ideology influenced the whole world under the name Malenevism. His ideology created a continent-spanning socialist state which became known as United Cantana, a superpower like the world has never seen. The Malenevist revolution in United Cantana reached far beyond the sea when the revolutionary efforts backed by Malenev caused one of the most powerful and global colonial empires, Volgos, to fall. It had transformed the country into a major socialist power called the Democratic Republic of Vogsland. The ripple effect from the fall of Volgos resulted in the massive decolonization of the continents of Zena and Rika, and the rise of socialist ideas in what was known to be the Third World. Threatened by the rise of socialist ideas, the first democracy of the world, Arcasia, supported democratic revolutions all around the world and heavily promoted capitalism in the continent of Mercopa. This led to the transformations of nations like Wayland, Lesbia, and Agnolia with from monarchies into democratic republics through peaceful and violent revolutions. The Arcasians quickly rose to prominence as a world financial center, military power, and cultural influencer. They took advantage of their safe geographic location in western Marcopa, as well as the instability in the rest of the world by making investments in other countries. The network of military and trade alliances they built up during the century resulted in Arcasia being considered a superpower. The democratic revolution in Sordland in 1923 is generally considered to be the end of the century of revolutions. In the aftermath of the century, a near bipolar world had emerged with United Cantana and Arcasia rising as the superpowers with two different ideologies. Despite the expectations of a global conventional conflict, such as a world war, never occurred. But the anxiety caused many smaller proxy wars around the world. Interesting. The Helgi was invaded by an opportunist Agnolian prime minister in the late 1920s when the Empire of Volgos was going through a revolution. The Agnolians had lost the island several hundred years ago when they sold it for a large sum of gold in order to pay their debts. The prime minister at the time justified the invasion by citing the safety concerns of Agnolian citizens who still lived in the island. After the revolution ended, the newly formed government of Vogsland focused on their new form of government instead of retaking the island. The action is regarded as the most successful land grab in recent history after the annexation of Dome by Rumburg. To many Agnolians, Helgi Island remains a matter of national pride and what a small country can achieve against a much stronger foe. The annexation of Dome. The annexation of Dome was an event that occurred in the early 1920s. Border tensions between Agnolia and Rumburg reached a boiling point with the death of King Alfred Livingston, whose Rumburgian dream outlined a large expansion plan toward the south of Marcopa. After the coronation of the new Queen Beatrice, she immediately devised an overwhelming night invasion toward the city of Dome, which took the Agnolian defenses by surprise. Thousands of lives were lost on both sides. The next day, Rumburg emerged victor and announced full control of the strategic, resource-rich city. The emboldened Rumburg foreign policy put Agnolia under existential threat. The oil fields surrounding Dome helped the resource-hungry industrial economy of Rumburg and damaged Agnolia greatly. The Izam Incident. The Izam Incident was a bloody protest and occurred in 1933. It is largely regarded as one of the foundational moments of the Bludish movement. In 1933, the Sol Dam project, which was proposed as a long-term solution to Bergia's and Sordland's energy problem, began its construction. The construction site was home to an old Bludish village called Izam, which was planned to be evacuated and razed to open the way for the dam. The arrival of the construction workers to the site led to a series of protests by the local populace. The protesters managed to block the construction and continued their protest for 10 days. On the 7th day, a group of military personnel arrived at the scene as a reaction to the protests' increasing size. On the 10th day of the protests, a village elder named Watani Ashraf was shot by one of the soldiers that caused the protest to turn violent. According to the Radical, the entire group of protesters were killed that day by the group of soldiers who were ordered by Tarquin Sol himself to make sure the construction was underway. Consequently, Izam was razed and the construction of the dam started soon after. This event led to a period of protests and riots in the region of Bergia. To suppress the riot, the state reacted by taking drastic measures, which included one of the most controversial of Tarquin Sol's decisions that resulted in the persecution of thousands of Bludish people. Calling the event the Bludish Genocide, a group of Bludish nationalists established a militant resistance movement called the Bludish Freedom Front. In the aftermath of the incident, the BFF has orchestrated attacks against the Sordish police forces and states buildings in major cities, starting a new period of bloodshed in the region. It was declared a terrorist organization by the government later in the same year. Every year, the Remembrance Day of Ashraf's death is widely attended by the Bludish people who treat it as part of their identity, while others use it as a symbol of separatist sentiment. The 15-Day War, also known as the 1870 Rumburgian-Sordish War, was fought between the 5th and 20th of October in 1870 by Sordland and Rumburg. In the months prior to the conflict, tensions became increasingly heightened after King Egmund cancelled the friendship deal between Sordland and Rumburg, which allowed Rumburgian ships to use the Sorn River, which flows from Alfredun, Krimsrad, Estord, and Lockhaven, be right here, to reach the Marchian Sea. King Alfred II of Rumburg reiterated his position. The closure of the Sorn River to Rumburgian shipping would be cause for war. King Egmund announced in May that the river would be closed to all Rumburgian vessels, and then mobilized Sordish forces along the northern border with Rumburg. On the 5th of October, Rumburg launched a series of preemptive attacks against the Sordish forces along the Rumburgian border. Simultaneously, Sordish forces launched a ground offensive into the city of Krimsrad, but were immediately pushed back. On the 10th of October, a group of ethnic Rums living in the city of Estord organized guerrilla attacks and sabotage missions that were aimed to cut the supply line of the Sordish forces. This resulted in the Sordish imperial forces to react by forcefully relocating all ethnic Rums living in the Nargis region to the border where battles were taking place. In the event known as the Estord Incident, many Rumburgian lives were lost when they were pushed into the front lines by the Sordish soldiers. Some sources claim that spontaneous killings by the soldiers took place for several days. After both Rumburgian and Sordish forces suffered casualties without any military successes, Rumburg and Sordland agreed to a ceasefire on the 20th of October 1870. The signing took place on a train in the outskirts of Estord in a forest that is now called the Forest of October. Dissension Day. Dissension Day marks the day when God sent his divine will down to St. Dast on the 16th of July in 684. The day is regarded as the beginning of the Neridi religion that spread nearly all around the world. Nowadays, Dissension Day is celebrated across the globe with many pilgrims visiting the initial site where the 30 disciples and St. Dast have begun their duties as servants of the Lord. Believers all around the world fast for an entire month before Dissension Day. After their fasting ends, they begin the long journey towards the Arch Sanctuary in Dare, where the tomb of Saint Dast and the Holy Scribbling, the Holy Scribbling lies. Inside the sanctuary, they are blessed by the servants of God for their selfless deeds. I'd like to believe that it is, in fact, just scribblings, like no one actually knows, and that the whole religion is just based on personal interpretations of some charismatic leaders. That'd be kind of funny, actually. For the many pious Neurists, this is the most important religious ritual a believer has to commit themselves to. Sordish Civil War. The Sordish Civil War was a period of violent battles that took place between three different armies of the Sordish armed forces and militant political organizations in Sordland. It started after General Luderan's military coup in 1927, when he executed hundreds of communists on the streets of Holsord in 1928. It provoked a huge reaction from both the public and General Rickard of the 7th Army, who ordered an attack on Luderan's forces, which started the Sordish Civil War. Both Young Swords and Red Youth were responsible for most of the urban warfare that took place in Holsord and Lockhaven during the war. While heavy fighting took place between the armies, many left-wing revolutionaries took to the streets and joined the Red Youth in hopes to use the situation to bring the revolution to Sordland. This led to thousands of nationalists to join the Young Swords in their fight against the revolutionaries. Tens of thousands of people were killed in the fightings that started in Holsord and rapidly expanded to corners of Sordland. Amidst the most bloody period of the war, Colonel Tarquin Sol of the 6th Army opened fire on the militant rebels of the Young Swords and Red Youth, killing hundreds of them in Conriat. Consequently, he joined the war and attacked both General Rickard and Luderan's forces. In 1929, Colonel Tarquin Sol destroyed the 3rd and 7th Armies and started pushing both sides to the east. After the Battle of Holsord, he won a victory over General Rickard's last remaining forces and brought an end to the Civil War. Following the war, he wrote a new constitution and re-established the Republic, becoming second president of Sordland shortly after. And finally, up to date now, the recession of 1951. After the large decline of Sordland in the Sordish Civil War, the recession of 1951 is known to be the largest economic subtraction in Sordland's history. The recession was triggered by a fast-paced privatization plan that disrupted the economy and caused hyperinflation. President Alfonso was widely blamed for the aggressive economic reform policies that put the country upside down. However, many obstructions in key government institutions seem to indicate that there was more at fault within the state than it is known, implying that the conspiracy of the deep state might be true. I don't know. Anyway, My throat now is raw after reading the whole damn thing. So hopefully we all now know kind of what's going on. I don't know how big of an impact any of that is going to have upon the things that we will be doing and the choices we have to make. Some of it I wish I kind of know before I had started the game. It might have changed some of my decisions, but we have yet to see how the rest of it is going to go. So anyway, that's it. We now return to the regular series.